Paul McCartney is celebrated as one of the most beloved musicians in history, known for his warmth, charm, and creative genius. As a founding member of the Beatles, he shaped modern music and influenced generations of artists. But behind the fame and friendly public persona, Paul has had his share of conflicts and personal frustrations. While the Beatles were no strangers to disagreements, especially during their later years, one particular relationship in Paul's life stood out as deeply strained and filled with tension. It wasn't just a mild dislike or professional rivalry. This was someone Paul McCartney truly could not stand. For decades, speculation has swirled about who this person might be. Was it a fellow musician, a business associate, or perhaps someone tied to the Beatles' inner circle? As it turns out, the person who drew Paul's lasting resentment was someone who played a pivotal role in the band's most turbulent chapter. Their presence sparked heated arguments, strained friendships, and ultimately became symbolic of the challenges that fractured one of the greatest musical groups of all time. What makes this story even more fascinating is that Paul, usually diplomatic and guarded in interviews, spoke about this figure with unusual bluntness. He did not hide his dislike and, in fact, admitted it openly in several conversations over the years. To understand Paul McCartney's hatred, one must revisit the chaotic final days of the Beatles, the rivalries, and the personal tensions that transformed a musical brotherhood into a battlefield. By the late 1960s, the Beatles had reached a crossroads. They were no longer just the cheeky lads from Liverpool. They had become the biggest band in the world, cultural icons whose every move was scrutinized. Yet, behind the scenes, the harmony that once fueled their creativity was beginning to fracture. Paul McCartney, always the perfectionist and natural leader in the studio, found himself clashing with his bandmates more often than not. John Lennon was becoming increasingly distant. George Harrison was eager to be taken more seriously as a songwriter, and Ringo Starr quietly struggled to keep the peace. Into this tense atmosphere entered Yoko Ono, John Lennon's partner. While she was not the sole reason for the Beatles' breakup, her constant presence during recording sessions added a new layer of tension. Paul, who had always believed that the band worked best when focused exclusively on the music, was deeply frustrated by what he saw as disruptions and distractions. To him, the Beatles' work was sacred, and the intrusion of outside influences, especially one as vocal and assertive as Yoko, was a violation of an unspoken rule that had held them together for years. What made the situation worse was that Paul and Yoko represented two entirely different worlds. Paul was rooted in melody, structure, and the pop tradition. Yoko, on the other hand, came from an avant-garde art background, pushing John toward experimental directions that clashed with Paul's vision. In Paul's eyes, this wasn't just about music. It was about control, influence, and the future of the Beatles. As the band recorded their final albums, the tension only grew. Paul tried to maintain order in the studio, often taking charge when the others seemed disinterested. This leadership, however, was perceived by some as bossiness. To Yoko, it looked like Paul was trying to control John, and she often inserted herself into conversations, challenging Paul directly. For a man used to having creative dominance in the group, this interference was infuriating. What particularly stung Paul was that his bond with John, the creative partnership that had once seemed unbreakable, was slipping away. He felt replaced, not only musically but emotionally, as John increasingly leaned on Yoko for support and validation. The private jokes, the brotherly connection, and the effortless songwriting chemistry of Lennon and McCartney seemed like distant memories. Every time Paul entered the studio and saw Yoko sitting by John's side, he was reminded that the golden era of the Beatles was gone. This backdrop of fading friendships and growing animosity created the perfect storm for resentment. While Paul was diplomatic in public, those close to him knew the depth of his frustration. He viewed Yoko not just as John's partner, but as someone who represented the unraveling of the band he had dedicated his life to. To him, she was the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong, the loss of unity, the creative battles, and the collapse of the dream that had captivated the world. By the time the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, Paul's dislike of Yoko Ono had hardened into something much stronger. It wasn't just irritation or professional disagreement. It was a deep, lasting resentment. In his eyes, she had driven a wedge between him and John and disrupted the delicate balance that had once made the Beatles unstoppable. The Beatles may have been a global phenomenon, but behind the scenes, their dynamic was far more complicated than fans realized. Paul McCartney, known for his tireless work ethic and perfectionist streak, was often at the center of this complexity. He wasn't content to simply write songs and play music. Paul wanted every note, every harmony, every detail to be just right. His vision pushed the band toward excellence, but it also rubbed his fellow bandmates the wrong way. John Lennon, in particular, bristled at Paul's need for control. John saw himself as the dreamer, the rebel, the artist who thrived in chaos. He loved spontaneity, while Paul wanted structure. Their creative differences had always been part of what made the Beatles special. But by the late 1960s, those differences began to feel less like sparks of genius and more like points of division. George Harrison, too, felt overshadowed. He had grown tremendously as a songwriter, penning tracks that would go on to become classics. But no matter how much George contributed, his songs were often pushed aside in favor of Lennon-McCartney compositions. Paul, especially, had a tendency to dominate recording sessions, fine-tuning not just his own songs but everyone else's. What Paul saw as helping the music, George saw as interference. This left George simmering with frustration, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Even Ringo Starr, the most easygoing of the four, began to feel the strain. Though less confrontational, Ringo disliked how tense the studio had become, and he sometimes felt like a bystander in the tug-of-war between Paul and John. What had once been a brotherhood was slowly unraveling, with egos, pride, and unspoken resentment driving deeper wedges between them. But it wasn't only internal disagreements that caused the rift. Outside influences started creeping in, and the Beatles' sacred creative bubble began to crack. Managers, business advisors, and eventually partners and spouses played roles in shifting dynamics. Paul was deeply protective of the Beatles' identity and legacy. He wanted decisions made by the four of them, not by outsiders. To him, the Beatles' magic existed because it was theirs and theirs alone. So when those boundaries began to blur, Paul's sense of control and his sense of family felt under attack. Paul's leadership style, once seen as the glue that held things together, now came across as overbearing. To his bandmates, it seemed like he wanted the Beatles to move only in the direction he envisioned. To Paul, however, he was simply trying to keep the band alive. He saw their disagreements as dangerous cracks in the foundation, and he believed his determination was the only thing standing between the Beatles and collapse. Still, no matter how much Paul tried, he couldn't ignore that something had shifted. Arguments became sharper, recording sessions more tense, and the joy of making music together began to fade. The Beatles were no longer the four carefree young men who had once conquered the world. They were older, burdened with fame, and less willing to compromise. And then came the presence that would transform those cracks into a full-blown fracture. For Paul, it wasn't just about clashing personalities or artistic visions anymore. It became personal. It became about one person who, in his mind, symbolized everything that was wrong with the band's future. That person was Yoko Ono. What started as creative disagreements soon evolved into open hostility, and Paul McCartney's resentment would grow into something that shaped the very end of the Beatles. The arrival of Yoko Ono in John Lennon's life changed everything, not just for him, but for the Beatles as a whole. To John, Yoko was not merely a partner. She was his muse, his collaborator, and his escape from the suffocating pressures of fame. But to Paul McCartney, her presence felt like an intrusion into a world that had always been sacred to the four bandmates. From the very beginning, Paul noticed a shift. The Beatles' recording sessions had always been their private domain. Even their wives and girlfriends rarely sat in during the long hours in the studio. But Yoko broke that unspoken rule. She wasn't just there, she was involved. Sitting next to John, she often commented on songs, offered her perspective, and even suggested changes. To Paul, this was unacceptable. The Beatles had built their success on the delicate balance of four voices. Now, a fifth voice, one he hadn't invited, was echoing through the studio. At first, Paul tried to tolerate it. He respected John's deep connection with Yoko and understood how important she was to him personally. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore how much influence she seemed to have over John's decisions. Conversations that once flowed naturally between the four Beatles now felt disrupted. If Paul suggested an idea that didn't align with Yoko's vision, John would often dismiss it outright. To Paul, it was as oldest friend and creative partner. He was speaking through Yoko's filter. This growing tension wasn't just about music. It was about loyalty, identity, and the fragile bond that had held the Beatles together for nearly a decade. Paul believed the group worked best when it was just them. No outsiders, no distractions. Yoko's constant presence made him feel like that bond was being torn apart. The camaraderie that had once defined their sessions gave way to awkward silences, sharp words, and cold stares. The other Beatles had their frustrations too. George Harrison disliked how the atmosphere had changed, and Ringo Starr, usually the peacemaker, eventually walked out of a session because the tension became unbearable. But it was Paul who took it the hardest. For him, the Beatles were more than just a band. They were a brotherhood, a family. And he felt like Yoko's presence was dismantling that family piece by piece. The strain became especially clear during the making of the White Album. Paul, eager to keep the group focused, pushed hard for perfection, but his relentless drive clashed with John's growing attachment to Yoko's input. The sessions turned chaotic, with members recording parts separately rather than together. Paul watched in dismay as the unity that once defined the Beatles dissolved before his eyes. In private, Paul confided to friends that he felt shut out. He had spent years pouring his soul into the Beatles, fighting to protect what they had built. And now he felt powerless. Every time he tried to assert himself, it only drove John and Yoko closer together. Paul's resentment grew, not only toward Yoko but toward John for allowing her to step into a role Paul believed belonged only to the Beatles themselves. For Paul, Yoko Ono became more than just John's partner. She became the symbol of everything he feared: the end of the Beatles, the loss of his creative brotherhood, and the shattering of a bond the world thought was unbreakable. As the tension reached its breaking point, Paul's frustration would turn into open conflict, setting the stage for the most painful chapter in the band's history, their breakup. By the end of the 1960s, the cracks within the Beatles had grown too wide to ignore. The brotherhood that once defined the band was replaced by bitterness, miscommunication, and a painful sense of betrayal. For Paul McCartney, at the center of it all was Yoko Ono. Her presence had changed John Lennon, reshaped the atmosphere of the studio, and, in Paul's eyes, hastened the end of the band he had fought so hard to keep alive. The collapse unfolded slowly, but surely. Recording sessions became battlegrounds where creative visions clashed more than they aligned. Paul, desperate to maintain order, tightened his grip even further, insisting on long rehearsals and meticulous arrangements. But the more Paul pushed, the more his bandmates pulled away. George Harrison, frustrated by the lack of respect for his growing songwriting abilities, temporarily quit the band during the Get Back sessions. Ringo Starr, disheartened by the endless tension, also walked out for a time. And John, now inseparable from Yoko, seemed less interested in preserving the Beatles than in exploring a new life with her. The final straw came in 1970. Paul, convinced the band needed to continue, released his solo album at nearly the same time as the Beatles' Let It Be. In doing so, he publicly announced what fans had feared: the Beatles were finished. While each member had played a role in the split, Paul placed much of the blame on Yoko. He felt that her influence over John had poisoned the group's unity and accelerated its downfall. In interviews over the years, Paul rarely held back his feelings. He admitted that he struggled with Yoko's presence in the studio and how she altered John's priorities. In his mind, she wasn't just a partner, she was the wedge that drove the Beatles apart. While John defended Yoko fiercely, Paul found it nearly impossible to forgive her for what he saw as the destruction of something sacred. Yet, time has a way of softening even the deepest wounds. In later years, Paul acknowledged that the breakup wasn't solely Yoko's fault. The band members had grown older, their ambitions had changed, and the pressures of fame had taken their toll. Still, even as he admitted that many factors led to the split, Paul's comments often circled back to Yoko. His resentment, while less fiery with age, never fully disappeared. Perhaps the most telling sign of Paul's bitterness was how personal it felt. It wasn't only about music, it was about losing John. For years, Paul and John had shared an unbreakable bond, finishing each other's songs, challenging each other creatively, and supporting one another through the chaos of fame. With Yoko in the picture, Paul felt that bond had been broken. It was as if he had lost not only his creative partner, but also his closest friend. Even after John's tragic death in 1980, Paul's relationship with Yoko remained complicated. Though they worked together occasionally on Beatles projects, the tension lingered just beneath the surface. Paul respected her role in John's life, but the memory of how things fell apart never truly left him. In the end, Paul McCartney's resentment toward Yoko Ono became one of the most famous rifts in rock history. For fans, it symbolized the heartbreak of watching the greatest band in the world fall apart. For Paul, it was far more personal. It was the story of how a once unshakable brotherhood crumbled, leaving behind not only broken music but also broken hearts. And while Paul went on to build an extraordinary solo career, the shadow of that resentment, of losing John to Yoko and watching the Beatles collapse, remained one of the most painful chapters of his life.